This is In the Moment. I am your host, Mohammed Ramadan, owner and founder of Ramadan and Associates, a Chicago-based law firm focusing on business and personal injury law. Listen in as we discuss everyday legal topics, a legal podcast made for everyday people, not just lawyers. Welcome, everybody. This is In the Moment. I am your host, Mo Ramadan, and today we have a wonderful guest. Today we have Scott Hibbard. He is an associate professor at DePaul University, now the chairman of the political science department. He is a professor, a scholar, as well as an author. His latest book, Religious Politics and the Secular State. Scott, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Scott.
Sure.
We got a lot to talk about, but before we get into that, I just want to kind of get a brief rundown. Give us some idea of your background, kind of where did you grow up, and, what degrees do you have, where did you go to college, so on and so forth.
Sure. So first thing first, I grew up in West Michigan, went to high school there and lived most of my life in West Michigan. Went to college in Colorado. This is in my younger, wilder days. And when I got out of college, I was very interested in getting into politics and packed up my car and moved to Washington, D.C. after a summer of working in a foundry and doing other things. And then I spent basically the next 7 years working on Capitol Hill. I dropped out for a year to go back and do a master's degree at the London School of Economics. I did a first master's at Georgetown University at night when I was young and motivated and working on Capitol Hill. And then when my last boss lost his bid for re-election in, I guess it was 1992, I ended up going from the legislative branch to the executive branch and went to work for the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a federally funded research institute dedicated to the nonviolent resolution of international conflict. So, yeah, it was.
It's a mouthful.
But anyway, but after those 12 years of kind of working in the game, I was interviewing for a number of different jobs. I had actually 3 rounds of interviews for a speechwriting job in the State Department. And every interview I went to, I was just thinking, I am done. I just need to do something different. Mm-hmm. And that's when I decided to go back and do the PhD. And there's a story behind that, which we don't need to get into. But I decided, to go back and do the PhD. So I did my PhD in my mid or early 30s.
What was your PhD in?
So it was in comparative politics and international relations. I did it at Johns Hopkins University, which is just a great school and worked out really well for me. It gave me an opportunity to spend some time in the Middle East. I did most of my doctoral research in Egypt, though I did a fair amount in India as well. And then I also was working. My third case study in my doctoral research was the United States. So look at the religion and politics of these three look at the religious politics of these 3 societies: Egypt, India, and the U.S. And
what was your dissertation about?
So what I was looking at was here you had 3 societies in the 1950s and 60s were the paradigmatic modern secularizing states. Nasser's Egypt, Nehru's India, and Kennedy Johnson America. Fast forward 20 years, how do you get the Christian right, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Hindu nationalists? What happened? And this really is where you're kind of getting into this discussion of religious politics within the context of secular states. And part of the line of argument that I pulled in, or that I was really kind of making in the book, was that this didn't just happen. That mainstream political actors saw religion as a useful tool to go after the secular and leftist opponents, and so you had a normalization of fundamentalisms, whether again Hindu nationalist or the Christian right in the United States or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and
Awesome. So we'll get into some of that, but I'm really interested about kind of your experiences in D.C. I lived in D.C. for about 7 months when I was in law school, and I always tell people there's no city like D.C.
Yeah.
New York, you can compare it to Chicago, vice versa. Yeah. Maybe Miami and L.A. have comparisons. You can always find some type of comparable city to almost any city in America, except D.C.
Yeah.
I feel D.C. is its own animal. It just ticks a certain way. There's a certain vibe to it. The whole DMV area, but, predominantly D.C.
Yeah.
So what years were you in D.C. working on the Hill?
So, I lived in D.C. from 1985 to 2005. So even when I was doing my PhD, I was commuting back and forth between D.C. and Baltimore. I was living with my wife, who was working on Capitol Hill at the time, and so that's part of the reason why we didn't leave. But on the Hill, I was there. I was on the Hill from 85 to 92, and then When my last boss lost his bid for re-election, I went to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I was there till '98, and I did my PhD between '98 and 2005.
Interesting. So you kind of saw
a lot of change.
Yeah,
a lot of change.
You've seen a variety. I
mean,
from let's say '85 to 2000. What's that?
Reagan,
4 presidents? Is it?
Yeah, that's right. So I think when I first arrived, so Reagan was president, and then of course George H.W. Bush, and then I was there through the Clinton era, and then George Walker W. Bush, and it was very different. I mean, the Reagan era, I would argue, kind of paved the way for what we're seeing today, because you saw a kind of polarization within the Republican Party at that moment in time. And, you had the old guard Republicans, the country club Republicans, the liberal, Republicans of the Jerry Ford ilk that were still very predominant, particularly when I worked in the Senate. And it was a very different place, because there were liberal Republican senators, there were liberal Democratic senators, there were conservative Republicans, there were conservative Democrats. You've seen a major realignment, in the Senate since that time. And I would argue that this just kind of reflects the larger realignment of the parties, over that same period in time. It took longer for it to unfold in the Senate.
Do you notice vibes change, or the way DC is per president? So, meaning, when one president leaves and a new president comes in. So let's say a Republican leaves and a Democratic president comes in. Does it change the vibe of DC? Just the people you see at the bars, at the restaurants, at networking events, or is generally the same people just transition within presidencies?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there are certain presidencies where it is a culture shift. I mean, so when Reagan came in, it was a culture shift. When Trump comes in, it's a culture shift.
In what sense, culture shift?
Just new people, bringing in much more ideologically partisan people. When you saw George Herbert Walker Bush, for example, when he transitioned from Reagan, it wasn't that different. And then when Clinton took over, there was definitely a kind of a positive esprit de corps, the sense that, okay, we're kind of leaving the past behind, we're moving into a more positive future. But at the end of the day, it wasn't all that different, because Bush George H.W. Bush represented the center of the Republican Party. Bill Clinton represented the centrist wing of the Democratic Party, and so a lot of their policies really didn't change that much. And the rank and file people that are around are still around, and people shuffle offices,
right.
And but it's not, you don't see a major change. I think that was different. I mean, I'm not living in DC now, but I think it was different when the Trump people came in, because they really brought in their own people and brought in a new bunch of a new strain of worker.
I see. So, people always want to know, how does DC work? What's the underbelly like, or what do they call it? The swamp, right?
Yeah.
The new term is the drain the swamp. So how does the belly of the beast work? I mean, is there a lot of backroom deals? Are deals done at the bars? Are deals done, formally? Do they go to each other's offices? How do deals really get done in DC?
Well, so my perspective is of a Hill staffer, working in the trenches. So I wasn't always in some of the high level positions, but the one thing I will say is even that has kind of changed. We were talking earlier about lobbyists and the role of lobbyists. Money is just huge, because money drives campaigns. You need to buy airtime to get elected. And so the people that have the money have a seat at the table when you're talking about a major piece of legislation. And so in some respects, there's a PR side of it. In some respects, there's a money side of it. But at the end of the day, it really is this kind of pure power. Do you have the votes to get stuff done? And a lot of that, is organization. And if you've got a good organization on Capitol Hill, you can get pieces of legislation through. If you've got good if you got good staff and you're tenacious, you can get stuff through. But anyway, so that's money. I would argue, though, is kind of the mother's milk of politics.
Wow. Still till today.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, in some respects, it's worse today, because there were times. And I'll digress on this for a second. So when I was working on my last job on Capitol Hill, was working for a member of Congress who sat on the House Energy Committee, and particularly the Telecommunications and Finance Subcommittee of House Energy and Commerce. And it was really interesting, because you're regulating Hollywood, you're regulating Wall Street, you're regulating the telecommunications industry, and this is back during the days of the baby bells. And so there's a lot of money. And so, like the member of Congress I worked for at the time had no problem raising money. But the issue was, he in some respects was kind of mediating between different competing interests, and this is kind of pluralism in action. The Bell companies wanted one thing, and the long distance providers wanted something else. The dish providers wanted something else. The cable industry wanted something else. And so, what the members of Congress were doing were really kind of mediating between these different factions. And at the end of the day, it wasn't necessarily who had the most money had the most say, but that went a long way to determining who actually was going to win the votes.
So, I mean, that's a very blunt question. With all that money floating around, all those interests, do they really give a shit what the actual people in their district want or care for?
So this is the tension between good policy and good politics. At the end of the day, and people argue that politics is driven by self-interest, and I argue that that's a kind of a stupid comment, because what is your self-interest? I mean, what are you trying to do? Are you just trying to get reelected? Or are you trying to represent your community? And at the end of the day, you're balancing competing interests, even as a member of Congress. And if you vote one way, you might help certain elements of your district. If you vote another way, it might help others. And so there's always, and at the end, and you're always kind of driven by, am I a national legislator who's trying to look out for the national interest and do what's right for the people, gun control, or am I looking at my district and configuration and how many NRA voters do I have? Another issue like Israel, right? I mean, who really cares about the Middle East in Iowa? Right. I mean, they don't.
It's true.
So if you look at what's good policy, good policy is this, but I got these people giving me lots of money, and my district really doesn't care about it because my district cares about farming. And so this is where money can kind of shift, or can kind of drive decisions that are going to affect national interest. And so there's this tension between the local, are you being true to your local people? Are you being true to your national interest, or what would you see as the national interest? Or, are you being influenced by outside interests?
Yeah, the reason I'm curious by that is because at the end of the day, they need money for their campaign re-election, correct?
That's it.
Well, then you're going to use that money to campaign to your district,
right?
Because you need their votes.
Right.
So I've always been curious, how do they balance the two? Because if you're going to ignore them to get the money, but then you're going to use that same money to use it to advertise, campaign, whatever it is, to get those people to vote. I guess what I'm asking is, why can't you just go directly to your constituents, vote for what they want? That should attract your votes. You won't need the lobbyist money. But that's a very naive viewpoint,
as soon as you have an engaged electorate. So this is always the challenge. A lot of elections are kind of determined by what's commonly referred to as low information voters. So people are voting.
Really?
People are voting based on the impressions they get from the media, from ad campaigns, and this is why you see so many. Why you see so many negative ads, because they work. You'll. The unfortunate thing is to craft a image and to spend a lot of money creating a positive image. That only happens over a long period of time, and it takes a lot of money, and it's not just television ads, it's appearances and going around and pressing the flesh and really doing your due diligence. By the way, I think this is actually going to help Joe Biden in the campaign, because he's already kind of defined who he is. But for any other candidate, first term person running for governor or whatever, you get a couple negative ads out there, and then people begin to really question the person's moral integrity, and this is one of the other aspects which. Talking about money in the game, the Citizens United
changed the game.
Totally changed the game.
Were you in D.C. when that decision was made?
No, it happened after. It happened after. But that really brought in not just dark money, but all these independent expenditures, 501c4s. And so now you have all these other actors. So it's not just my campaign running against your campaign, but now you've got these independent actors, bringing in or entering into different races and really swaying people's opinion. And this is where, again, if you had an educated electorate who could see through a lot of the the disinformation, we would all be better off as a society. But
Citizens United has allowed a guy like Sheldon Adelson to basically tell the Republican Party, come kiss the ring.
Yeah.
Which they do. Trump has been trying to kiss the ring for the past few months, and I guess he was mad at Trump or something, and Trump is going out of his way to cater to Sheldon Adelson, who I think the Trump election, the first one, I think 300, 400, 500 million he dumped in, which, total bullshit.
Yeah,
a guy like Sheldon Adelson should not be able to control an entire half of our electorate party. It's insane. And I didn't get to sit as a united decision. And I do think that gave carte blanche to lobbyists.
Yeah, totally. Well, and to kind of corporate America. And I think this is where...
Which most of them are
lobbyists. But one of the things that you've also, which we could talk about a little bit more later if you're interested, but again, going back to the notion of realignment, you really have seen this realignment in American politics, and the Republican Party has really gone, on the one hand, very, very, very corporate. Not that the Democratic Party doesn't have its corporate interests; it definitely does. But it's gone not just corporate, but it's gone all in on the fossil fuel industry, and linked that with all of this kind of religious conservatism, and that nexus, if you will, has become really, really pernicious, and it's one of the reasons why it's really difficult to get anything done, because the Senate is controlled by Mitch McConnell, and he will stop pretty much anything that's going to deal with climate change or any number of other issues that are really, really pressing.
So, what stops politicians from wanting public campaign financing? Because, I always say the only way to really get money out of politics is to get money out of politics, right? I mean, it's a very simple thing. Yeah. Public campaign financing. And as a politician, if I have good policy and I believe in my policy, I should be all for public campaign financing. But also, I tell people you can't expect Nancy Pelosi to vote against her own interests, because she does not want public campaign financing. Neither does McConnell. These guys that have $1 million campaigns, they don't want public campaign financing. So let's take the McConnells and the Pelosis out of the picture. Why don't politicians want public campaign financing?
Well, it depends on which politicians you're talking about. I mean, I think you're hitting on the important issue, though. If you look at campaign finance reform in the past, the McCain-Feingold bill, it was all about regulating how much money people can give. So they're kind of working on the supply side. I always argue that the real problem is the demand side. That why do people want $1 million war chest? Well, to run ads. Mm-hmm. And if you made, back in the day, where people got most of their information was over their television, you could, demand, free access to the airwaves. For a variety of reasons, that never happened. But that would have been a solution that would have been a demand-oriented solution. It would have dramatically lessened the cost of campaigns. And then you really are, kind of running on ideas. You're not necessarily running on who's got the biggest, war chest. I think one of the problems that's thrown a wrench in all of this is Citizens United, because now, again, it's not just campaigns that are raising money, but you have all these 501c4s and all these other, kind of independent expenditures, which are kind of manipulating, the outcome of the events or of the campaigns. And then you have this fragmentation of the media market, so social media, and then of course cable is just the explosion of cable. My in-laws, my mother-in-law passed away recently, but she and my father-in-law, they live out in Oregon or out on Washington State, and they watch not just Fox but like Blaze TV, which is where Glenn Beck went after he got kicked off of Fox for being too radical.
So. You got to be very radical to get kicked off of Fox for being radical.
And so things, so you have this fragmentation of the media market. So it's, so even if you had free over-the-air broadcasting or like airtime for candidates, you're still not reaching this kind of very dispersed media market.
Interesting. Yeah, the money issue is always going to be an issue, and that's why some folks argue we're not a true democracy. I kind of lean towards that way, because I just think the money influence is just it's just ridiculous.
Pernicious.
It is pernicious. And then I tell people, I put myself in a politician's shoe. I kind of don't blame them. They're playing the game by the rules that they were given. So even if I want to be pure and I want to run on policy, well, my opponent's not, and I want to win. And especially, the House. Yeah. I mean, they're running every 2 years. So essentially, they're campaigning 24/7.
Nonstop.
The moment they're elected, they might have a party. They might relax for a week or two. Yeah. But they're back campaigning. And I've talked to people in D.C., and they tell me how these politicians go in a certain room for hours just picking up the phone. Yeah. making these calls. So they're not really allowed to govern. So I think that the money really, really affects it. So back to kind of a procedural element. Do the actual politicians make these moves, or is it their staffers, their chief of staff, their folks that really get it on a silver platter and then say, Congressman so-and-so, this is how we should go? How does the actual behind the scenes work?
When I worked on the Hill, and particularly like the last 2 years, which is when I was legislative aide for this member of Congress from Maryland, what I would do is I would always I'd meet with lobbyists from different sides. We always had a consumer interest person as well involved, whether it was financial industry reform, insurance regulatory restructuring, cable industry reform. I mean, we were very, and I would say Democrats back in the day were very consumer oriented. So the consumer interest lobbyists were part of the game. I don't think you see them around much these days. They don't have the clout they once did. But what you do is you'd get the views of all these different players, and then you do your research on the background of the issue. What this amendment going in this committee or for this piece of legislation. And I would lay out the arguments from a policy perspective, pro and con. And here's where the different industries line up and what their arguments are. And then I would have a section on the politics of it and say, here's, so these guys are in our district. These guys aren't. This is who we've heard from in the district. And so, if you were a representative from, Anne Arundel County or Annapolis, Maryland, or whatever, you're looking at your district, you're seeing how a piece of legislation is going to affect your district, and and you base your judgment in part on who's backing you financially and politically. But you're also looking at how it's going to affect your district, and it's up to the staff to kind of make sure the congressman is well informed on all those issues. And at the end of the day, he's the one that pulls the trigger. Now, the interesting twist is, particularly in the House, then you get the lobbying by the chairs, the chairs of the committees, the leadership, the whips, the majority leader, speaker, and and that matters. And they may say, Mo, we need you on this vote. We can let you go on some of these other things, but we need you on this. And you may not want to do it, but you bite the bullet because you're trying to be a good team. Senate's very different because the Senate's it's basically 100 autonomous individuals who don't listen to anybody. So there's less power to coerce people. But on the House, it's very different dynamic.
And I think that's what's made Pelosi very powerful and influential. I think, as much as I don't agree with a lot of things she does, for lack of better words, she's a gangster. Yeah. And in a positive way, what I mean by that is she knows how to maneuver personality. Yeah. She knows how to get everyone to kind of align to what she wants. Yeah. And I think she puts a smile on in public, but I think behind closed doors, she's not a lady you want to mess with. Yeah. And that's the perception that I get. And I think to be in her position, you kind of have to be that way. Yeah. One, do you kind of see that? And I'm using Pelosi because she's now, but whoever's in charge of the House, I think they have to have a certain gangsterism to them, for lack of a better word. Yeah. Because you got to corral 200 plus, people. Yeah. So how much influence does a Pelosi have over all that?
A lot. Well, particularly in the House. In the Senate, less so, because, again, just the way in which rules are structured. The House, if you don't go along with leadership, you lose your committee assignments or you get poor committee assignments. You don't rise in the in the ranks as quickly as you might. You may be relegated to a backwater of assignments, and no one wants that, right? Just two comments I'll make on to kind of elaborate on some of the points you touched on. You asked earlier about how do you get things done. One of the big issues is not getting stuff done, but keeping stuff from happening. And this is, in some respects, what's really happened over the last, 2, 3, well, actually probably last 10 years, particularly under the McConnell, Senate. Obama was trying to get stuff through, and once the Senate went Republican, they just filibustered everything. And so, and this is not, that kind of obstructionism is not new. It's happened before, but the level of it is really, really kind of shocking. So in some respects, part of what the game is now is not necessarily, getting stuff through, but rather keeping stuff from happening. And it's one of the reasons why you see so much policy now being made through executive orders, either by Obama or by Trump. But the second thing, and this kind of ties into what you're talking about with Pelosi, is the reason why it's so easy to obstruct is because the rules are designed to allow politics or from legislation to be obstructed. And that's, whether it's the filibuster in the House, or filibuster in the Senate, or just the way in which, the process operates, or the Senate procedure operates on the Senate floor, or the way in which, if you control the Rules Committee in the House, you can determine which, committee reviews different pieces of legislation. If you know the rules, you can really get a lot of stuff done. But again, the way the rules are designed are try to, kind of hinders efforts to actually get legislation passed. And that's why somebody like Pelosi, if she really knows the rules, in a way that Representative or Senator Bobby Byrd back in the day, I mean, he was the master of the rule book. And he could, tie you up in knots on the Senate floor because he just knew the rules so well. And I would argue that part of the flaws in the American system right now are really, problems within the Constitution and the way in which we've, created the Electoral College or empowered the Electoral College, the way in which we have empowered, small states within the Senate. I mean, those kinds of things are really having an incredibly negative impact on American, politics and on American society.
Yeah, I mean, McConnell's from Kentucky. I mean, he's arguably, I would argue, if not the most powerful man in America, he's top 3 or 4. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And, say what you want about McConnell, but I think he really knows the rules very well. Yeah. And he knows how to play them, when to play them, how to play them. And he has the personality of a doorknob. Yeah. But strategically, the guy knows what the hell he's doing as far as the rules of how it works. And I think that's his strength. But to your point, I mean, the guy's a senator from Kentucky. I mean, it's not like California or New York or Texas
right.
or
Michigan or Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, he's from Kentucky. So, McConnell just really plays the game. And, I always say the phrase, don't hate the player, hate the game. He's playing by the rules. They're legal. Yeah. We set them up to allow them to do this. Yeah. So I think, our system is to blame. And, back to the wealthy, I think they're very influential now because I can call my congressman or woman, and I might get a template email back if I'm lucky. But if I'm wealthy, I'm gonna get a sit down, right? And I know you have a funny story about a very wealthy individual that's well known. We're gonna leave his name out of it, but he's a very wealthy individual, owns a lot of TV stations amongst other things. So I kind of wanted you to explain this story. Okay. One, it's funny. 2, I think it gives us a good idea of, how backdoors really work.
Yeah. So we were talking about this earlier, but there was I worked for a member of Congress in my last stint on Capitol Hill in the House side. And there was on the prelude, or like the day before, a major piece of legislation was going to come through the Telecommunications and Finance Subcommittee. We were going to have a markup on it. And this individual and his company had an interest in how this, certain amendments to the bill were going to come through. So we had a big sit down for noon, and he and his staff were going to come by, or the lobby shop, if you will, going to come by and meet with me and the congressman. And I get this call about 45 minutes before the meeting, and one of the junior lobbyists said, "Hey, Scott, let's go for a cup of coffee. I got some questions I want to ask before the meeting." So we go to get a cup of coffee, and she starts ordering food, and I'm like, okay, this is weird, like where is this going? And and we're talking, and we never really get to business. And I'm like, what's going on? I hate this. I really got to get back. And she's like, okay, well, don't worry about it. I'll pick up the tab. Just I'll see you in a bit. When I walked back into the office, the secretary is like, Scott, where have you been? The congressman is meeting with your 12 o'clock meeting. And I'm like rushing in. I'm totally embarrassed. And then there he is with the senior lobbyist. And they're like just shaking hands, closing up the meeting and saying, don't worry, Congressman, I've never asked you to do anything that doesn't serve all of our interests. And I'm like, okay. Okay. So it's just like, it was one of those things where,
that's how it works.
Yeah. It can be kind of brutal.
Awesome. So I want to shift a little bit because a lot of your focus now does involve religious politics and within the secular state. So back to your PhD, what made you get into the religious politics side of it, and what kind of made you start looking into that realm?
Okay, that's a good question. So part of it goes back to my upbringing in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which,
really?
You may not appreciate this, but Grand Rapids is a very, very, very religious community. It's a very, for the most part, culturally conservative community. But I was raised in the non-denominational liberal Protestant church in the sea of Dutch Christian reform, conservative Dutch Christian reform. And my mother was extremely active in politics in the 60s and 70s, everything from getting the environmental legislation going, or we have a bottle return bill that was pushed through back in the day, and she would collect signatures for that after church. And she was also involved with women's rights, and she got the abortion rights referendum on the Michigan ballot, and they did that after church. They collect, she and her colleagues were collecting signatures
after church.
After church. But the thing is, you have to realize at the time, from their perspective, as liberal Protestants, is as long as there are unwanted pregnancies, there will be abortions. The question is, will women have a right to not die in a backroom abortion alley, or doing backroom abortions? So from their perspective, it's an enormous problem, but there's this whole part of the problem which we can resolve if we just bring it out of the shadows, if you will. And of course, the opposition was not the opposition was culturally conservative, but it was also fellow Protestants, but culturally conservative Protestants. So you had again the Dutch Christian Reformed Church, Catholic Church was kind of split on this, but for the most part, the church itself was opposed to the abortion rights referendum. But individual Catholics were supportive. So what I realized, and I became very politicized in that era. I took it through high school and into college, and it was only in later years that I began to realize that, or my interest in religious politics really began to manifest, and I was really fascinated by these, by the cleavages within religions. So it's not necessarily Muslim versus Christian versus Jew, but rather there are liberal elements in all these traditions that actually have more in common with one another. Modernist, liberal, however you want to describe them. And then you've got illiberal or fundamentalist, factions within each of these communities, which actually have quite a lot in common with them, with one another. So just as an example, Steve Bannon recently produced a video that helps bring the Christian right together with the alt-right. And the spokes, or the guy who was regulating it, or who was moderating it, was from Duck Dynasty. But anyway, I watched a short clip of it, and it's all about how we need to have God's laws, not man-made laws. Mm-hmm. And he was going on and on and on about this, and I kept thinking, God, this guy sounds like Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb, because the narrative is the same. Yeah. And again, they're approaching it from very much the same perspective, and they all argue for a closer relationship of religion and state. Whereas, coming from my liberal tradition, we look at, religious diversity in a society and realize that if you have a established church, then that's going to make all other denominations, either within a tradition or outside the tradition, second rates or second tier citizens or second tier religions. And so part of the reason why we have a secular institution, a formal separation of church and state in this society, was really to avoid the kind of, religious bloodshed that you saw in Europe in earlier years. Now, that issue, just because you've got a formal separation of religion and or religious authority and political authority, does not necessarily mean religion is out of politics.
Correct.
And so religion has always been a part of politics, and this is basically what my research was on, is how do the Democrats and progressives invoke religion to support their policies, and how do conservatives, fundamentalists invoke religion to promote their set of policies.
Yeah, I always said religion is inherently political. You just cannot separate the two.
They're both about values at the end of the day.
Yes, there's a spiritual element to religion, but the Prophet Muhammad had, I always say, part of his role was a politician. I mean, he had to corral people. He had to create laws. I mean, he was a politician. You could even argue Jesus was, Moses was, all these historic religious figures essentially had some politician in them, because that politics is just how you maneuver with people. I mean, that's how I see it in a simple sense. So I do think religion is inherently political, which we look at it now. The religious conservative right is enamored with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is a guy who's been divorced multiple times.
Bankrupted casinos.
Been with hookers and strippers. I mean, says things that I'm not going to say again, that, we all know the things that he said, and they defend him. Please explain this. Okay. I cannot put my finger on how or why they're so, and again, it's not just they like him. They love
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, where does that come from?
So I think there are kind of two or three different aspects to it. One is that in some respects they see him as the strong man that's able to deliver on their policy priorities. And here, there's this within the Christian right. There's a number of books that have come out recently that talk about this, and I've of course been kind of pouring through them. But one of the things that keeps one of the recurring themes is there's this biblical story of Cyrus the Persian king who liberates the Jews from Babylonian or ends the exile, right? And so they look at him like that, and they look at him as a flawed human being that God has chosen to deliver them their goods, if you will. And the assumption is he's going to make the country a true Christian nationalist, society. He's going to roll back rules on. He's going to change things on abortion. He's going to fight off what they see as the incursions of the secular left into their lives, whether it's requiring or recognizing LGBTQ marriages or forcing people to provide cakes at their weddings or what have you. So they see it as a element of cultural autonomy, and they see him as their strong man who's advocating on behalf of them. Now, implicit within that is an enormous amount of racism, because it's really about maintaining kind of white Christian dominance and white Protestant Christian dominance. And that's always been part of the narrative. Although it's different. The right these days is kind of an amalgamation of religious right and alt right. Some are more clearly kind of fascist or Nazi-esque, or neo-Nazis. Others are more kind of religious. But the other side of it is this kind of goes back in time, and this goes back to the southern strategy I was kind of alluding to earlier. That part of the reason why religious conservatism has gone so mainstream in policy circles is because different political actors, secular political actors, if we will, saw utility in manipulating religion for their benefit. So Richard Nixon began this with a Southern strategy. He was actually a Quaker, if you can believe it. But I'm not sure he had really devout views, but he certainly did when he appeared at a Billy Graham revival festival in the midst of the Vietnam War. And what he was trying to do is blend patriotism, Christianity, and the flag and wrap it himself in it. And to argue that those people that are attacking me for Watergate, policies I've pursued in Vietnam, they're un-American and they're anti-God. Oh. And so he began this policy, or he began this electoral strategy, which invoked religion and cultural issues as a way of changing the discourse, or changing the frame of debate, moving away from class issues, economic issues, which is what the New Deal coalition was based on during the early Democratic eras, and kind of find a way to reach, working class and ethnic voters, and get them to vote for a party that has historically represented the interests of corporate America. It worked really well, and basically since Reagan, and when I say ethnic voters, I'm talking like Poles and Germans, and but that was the strategy, and it worked extremely well, and you've seen variations of that basically from Nixon to the present. And the one example I'll use, which is kind of highlights the instrumental manipulation part of this, was George Herbert Walker Bush. 1988, he comes out. He's running against Mike Dukakis. It's a tough election. Dukakis is not well known in the American public. Does really well in the primary process, and Lee Atwater, who's Bush's campaign chairman, realized that they're down in the polls, coming out of the conventions. And so basically from between the conventions and the final, or the general, they start running just these blistering ads, incredibly negative ads. They run the infamous Willie Horton ad, which basically blames Dukakis for the murder of some woman who was murdered by an individual out on leave from a parole. Willie Horton. Yeah. And it had race written all over it. And again, it's like if you don't hear the echoes, you're not listening. That's if you vote for Mike Dukakis, you're basically allowing black and brown people to come murder your
Whistling Dixie.
Yeah, and and it was brutal. And Lee Atwater has a very famous interview where he talks frankly about it. Like, we're talking law and order, we're talking states' rights, we're talking guns, but the people who are listening are hearing hearing racist whistle calls or dog whistles, and that's been a subtle part of the Republican campaign strategies, basically from Nixon to the present. What's interesting is the way in which Trump is just overt about it.
Yeah,
there's
he doesn't hide it.
There's no subtlety.
Yeah.
It's overt.
There's no sugarcoating it.
And I think what really struck me when I was looking at the 2016 primary process is you look at those people that were overtly religious. The Ted Cruzes of the world, the Ben Carsons of the world. They didn't do well. Mm-mm. They talked they said all the right things.
Why do you think that is?
Well, in part because they think that the electorate really is, or at least that constituency, the evangelical, are really about religion, when in reality it's a communal sentiment, that there's a sense that that their cultural identity is under assault. And so they want a strong man to stand up and fight and to go after the jugular of those secular liberal elitists who are oppressing us and shoving.
So they want a goon. They don't want a soft.
Right. But also the issues that really animated them were not necessarily prayer in school. I mean, that's what the religious leadership wanted. The things that really animated people were things like immigration. And when
the subtleties.
Yeah, and when Trump comes out and he's like,
build a wall.
Yeah, build a wall. People loved it because again, it ties in these narratives that are not new. I mean, particularly after 9/11, all this stuff comes out about the immigration is watering down the white Christian ethnic community in the America. If given time, and these themes play out in Europe as well. If given time, Muslims are going to take over Europe.
We're the new boogeyman.
Yeah, totally. And and again, Arabs, Muslims, Hispanics, blacks. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's the other, the demonized other. And Trump really just played that. And that community, because of their, again, going back to our notion of the fragmented media market, they buy into that. And they buy into a particular worldview because of the information that they get fed on a daily basis. And Trump speaks directly to that worldview.
Yeah, that's why when people say, well, he tells it like it is. And that's code for he's allowing us to be racist, and that's kind of how I look at it. I guess the big contradiction I see is, and you know this about me, I'm kind of a moderate Republican, right?
Yeah.
A lot of my views, we talk about this often.
You're Jerry Ford, man. Who knew?
Right? But it's like, where have all the moderate Republicans gone? And, the contradiction I see is a true moderate Republican wants less government. But these conservative Republicans want the government to intrude on everything.
Yeah.
So I never understood that contradiction. So where are the Kasich Republicans, what I call these days the Kasich Republicans? Where are the moderate Republicans? Why are they so scared? Is it because the conservatives really vote, or they have no strategy? What's with the moderate Republicans? Why have they disappeared?
So I would argue that, there's two elements to this. One is they've been pushed out of the Republican Party. They've been basically forced in a position of either get with the program or get out. And I keep thinking that Bob Corker is a good example of that. Right? He was senator from Tennessee, and he antagonized Trump, and basically he was running for a re-election. Or I think he just decided to step down. But Jeff Flake similarly, was trying to chart an alternate course. And Trump really turned on him, and his base, Flake's base of support, really dried up, and so he's no longer in the Senate. But this goes back. This is not a new phenomenon. This goes back many, many years. I remember a colleague of mine when I was working on Capitol Hill. He was like you, centrist Republican, but he happened to be working for a centrist Democrat. I was working for a Democratic senator named Dale Bumpers from Arkansas when I first got out of college. And this colleague of mine, Mike, was he was working in the mailroom with me, and we were just cutting our teeth. And he I think he actually worked for he had interned for Kennedy, and he had gotten a job with Joe Kennedy doing some kind of energy policy. But anyway, the punchline of the story is he then it's like, okay, I got to return to my roots. I got to I've got all these Democratic connections, but I'm a Republican, so I want to go to the Republican want to get a job with the Republicans. So he goes to the Republican National Committee, and there's there's an office in the Senate where they vet resumes, and he goes in and he's given a pitch. I got all this background, I got all this experience. But now I really want to work for Republicans, and they're really excited. But then they look at his resume and they're like, you are just too centrist for us, because this was during the Reagan era. They really were kind of already culling, the staff, and those that were centrists, were gone, and those that were more ideological, were getting jobs, and you see the same thing in the think tanks. If you're a hardline Republican, you can get a job at AEI, American Enterprise Institute.
But why though? Isn't there enough moderate Republicans to win them into election, or do they really see that? Hey, they might be not jobs, but those conservatives vote.
Yeah.
Is it that? I mean, what made them shift to get rid of the moderate Republicans, or were they even ever really in power?
Well, so that's a complex question. I think part of it is this Southern strategy, which I was talking about, was originally done by Republican Party elites who tend to be pretty centrist and pretty pragmatic. Mm-hmm. But once you start playing that game, these people will start wanting a seat at the table, and they start wanting more of a say in how things are being run, and so they become more influential within the party. I think the other side of it is a lot of people left and have now joined the Democratic Party. And like my father is a classic case. Right? So my grandfather helped get Jerry Ford started in politics up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, back in the 40s, I think it was. And my dad was a lifelong Republican. But after John McCain picked Sarah Palin, that was it.
That was a dagger.
Yeah, it was it.
Why was that a dagger for him?
Well, so it's funny. So my dad served in the Navy and just loved John McCain. He wanted to vote for John McCain, but his tolerance for the Christian right just is zero. And it kind of gets back to your point. At the end of the day, my dad's kind of a libertarian. And it's like, look, I don't want people butting into my life. And I don't want the Christian right telling me what I do with my, end of life issues. I don't want them telling me, whether or not how my wife or my daughter should be, running their lives, and, who has control of their body. And this was actually a really big issue, if you remember the Terry Schiavo case.
Yes.
So my dad's sister was dying of Alzheimer's. Well, she was dying, and she had Alzheimer's, and it was a really just a unfortunate end to life. But my dad knew that either he or somebody in the family, Uncle Hank, Dad, we're going to have to make a decision to pull the plug. I don't want the government involved in that. And here's the Republican Party, first at the state level, then later in the U.S. Senate, trying to intervene in this end-of-life decision of a family. And my dad was just mortified by it. And you could argue, there was a moment in time where it's like, okay, well, that's just one faction of the party. I can get by with that. But when you see Sarah Palin come, get tapped, not just get tapped, but really kind of take over,
mm-hmm.
Dad's like, that's it.
See, your dad is the kind of Republican that I am.
Yeah,
rational, pragmatic.
He's 87 years old.
I've been told I'm an old soul, so I think your dad and I would get along really well. But that's the Republican that I say when I say, oh, I think I'm a moderate Republican. It's that rationale, that pragmatism, I believe in less government, but I don't believe in total government intrusion. I think there should be, some regulation. So I just don't feel like that rational, everyday common sense is no longer there. And I say that about both sides now, right?
Yeah.
So I look at both parties, and hence why I consider myself an independent. I register, I don't know if you could register, but I claim to be independent. I know we're in Illinois, we're in Chicago, it's predominantly Democratic. But, when people ask me, I tell them I'm independent. The reason is I think the radical sides of both parties have now taken control. Now, I'm not saying progressives are radical, but some of their ideas are, pretty radical, right? And then you got your conservatives who are just, I'm sorry, but they're nut jobs, for the most part. I know you can't say that, so I'll say it for you. So it's like you have the battle of the crazies, right?
Yeah.
But the reason I don't understand is I think majority of Americans are like you and I, middle. You might tilt left, you might tilt right. But I'd like to argue 70, 80% of America is somewhere in the middle, yet no party is campaigning in the middle. Yeah. And I don't understand it. So, liberals are getting less and less religious by the minute. And then the conservatives are getting even more religious. They want a damn near a crusade to happen. How do you address this growing divide, and how does it affect people like myself, who I consider myself in the middle, where I'm spiritual, I'm somewhat religious, but I'm not, crazy religious, right? So how do you address this widening gap?
So there are a couple points in there. Let me touch on each in turn. The first issue is this notion of elections and being won or lost in the middle. And I've always argued that if you can capture the middle ground, you're going to win the election. And this is actually one of the reasons why I think that Biden and Harris ticket have an edge, because the Republicans, because they've gotten so extreme, they've really ceded that centrist middle ground. And what they'll try to do is they'll try to portray Biden as captured by the left and basically a socialist. But I think he's been around long enough that people have an impression of him, and that will not. Those negative ads won't stick. But anyway, to get back to your question, that I think that at the end of the day, the Democrats really, at this moment in time, even though yes, they have this this left wing, where the momentum is in the center, and so I think they are going to be kind of capturing that. But you're touching on a larger issue that my father is a very non-ideological person. He's a very pragmatic person. And what you've seen happen over the last 30 years is the ideological transformation of the Republican Party into a hyper partisan, hyper ideological party. And there's an interesting book by Norm Ornstein and Thomas Mann, which kind of gets to all this. It was written in 2012, reissued in 2016, but they are charting this back like 8 years ago, and they're looking at that. This is this trend has been building for a long time. And so it's a roundabout way of saying that we have to be careful that we're not making false equivalency, because the Republican Party is hyper ideological in a way that the Democrats are not. And I think this is part of the fact that yes, we have our ideological wing, no two ways about it, but we have a much broader kind of spectrum, if you will, of people the Democrats have within their party. And the centrist voice is more powerful in the Democratic Party. Now, where does this go? That's the $64,000 question. My real concern is that the hyperpolarization is eroding the fabric of American society, and I would argue that as a society we are much less polarized than our politics are. But there are political forces and media forces that benefit by hyping the threat. Fox News, basically, the more they stoke the fire, the higher their ratings go. And it's now kind of gone off into this netherworld of its disparate reality. The mainstream media, I would argue, is not left, it's just corporate. MSNBC, definitely left of center, but CNN and ABC, NBC, they're very, very, very centrist. And
I disagree on that, but
okay. But the thing is, I think they're very corporate. Is more than anything
that
else.
I agree with.
What they're really about is ratings and revenue, right? So how do we rebuild that pragmatic center? I think that part of it is going to have to come with delegitimizing the ideas of the far right that have become mainstream and have been increasingly tolerated, but not just by politicians, but by the media. Mm. And I think this is one of the I love Barack Obama, but I think one of the big failings is there was no accountability for the 2008 financial collapse, for the people that were involved in it, for the fraud. Nobody really went after the underlying ideas of of neoliberal economics that justified this kind of go-go casino market for Wall Street, and nobody went to prison for manipulating intelligence for the invasion of Iraq. So there have been in some respects the ideas of the old order were never challenged, and I get why it happened. There was a moment in time when Obama was just trying to get or just try to get the economy back on track, try to get things back on track. But the assumption was that people would have learned that lesson, learned the lesson of what went before us was flawed. We need to move into a positive future. It was really shocking that those ideas and those political forces were able to kind of remobilize so quickly and stymie a lot of what the Obama administration was trying to do. And I think because of that, we now have a new opportunity to kind of challenge the ideas that that kind of have undermined a lot of American society.
The sad thing is, your answer basically talked about what we talked about in the beginning. Money talks, bullshit walks. It's how America runs. They say America runs on Dunkin'. I say America runs on money. So, Scott, I'll end on that note so I don't get you in trouble with my big mouth. But you were great, Scott, as I predicted. Let people know how to get your book. I know you have other books out there. So just give us a brief thing. I know you're not a big social media guy, but if you do, let us know if you're on Twitter or anything like that so people can catch you and let them know where they can find your book.
Okay. Well, first of all, you can just I've got a webpage at DePaul University. Just Google Hibbard and DePaul will come up. And then, of course, you can go to Amazon.com and get Religious Politics in Secular States.
Awesome. Of course.
I've also got an edited volume with Laith Saud and Eminem McLeod on Islam in the 21st century.
Oh, nice. Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We're glad to have you on. We've been wanting to get you on for a while, so perfect timing. Thank you for coming on. And now it's time for my Minute with Mo. And today I want to talk about something that really bothers me, but I've always wanted to talk about. Shut up and dribble. It's something that has been said and spoken about often, and I just don't understand it. Can you imagine if they told Muhammad Ali to shut up and fight? Can you imagine if they told Jim Brown to shut up and run? Could you imagine if they told Jackie Robinson to shut up and bat? I'm not comparing today's athletes to those three guys, but I'm comparing the concept. And this whole shut up and dribble, I don't understand it. They built a platform. We are allowed to use our platforms for whatever, we choose to do. If LeBron James wants to talk about a certain issue and use his platform and potentially risk millions of dollars in endorsements doing so, LeBron James has the right to do so. So I don't understand this whole idea of shut up and dribble. It's extremely un-American. I don't know why people expect athletes to just be non-human robots. I won't get into the racial undertones of that because there's clearly some racial undertones of that because nobody questioned Pat Tillman when he went to the Army. Nobody told him to shut up and play football. So there's a lot of racial undertones to that. I just don't understand the shut up and dribble. If an athlete wants to talk and use his platform, they are no different than any politician, any speaker on CNN or Fox News. People don't have a problem with Tucker Carlson spewing his bullshit all the time. So why do you have a problem with LeBron James spewing whatever he's quote unquote spewing on camera? So to all those that say shut up and dribble, I tell you, just shut up, period. That's our show for today. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you on the next In the Moment.